In the quiet, snow-draped town of Pine Ridge, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies, fate had woven a mystery no one could have predicted. Dr. Thomas Walker was no stranger to long nights and exhausted departures from the town hospital. But on one bitter evening, something unusual stopped him in his tracks. A lone bobcat kitten, its fur dusted with frost, sat motionless outside the hospital entrance. Its golden eyes, steady and knowing, seemed to hold a question. A silent plea that only Thomas could answer. At first, it was just an oddity, a fleeting moment of curiosity. But when the kitten returned night after night, its silent vigil unbroken, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was no mere coincidence. What was it waiting for? And why did it refuse to leave? As the nights passed and the mystery deepened, Thomas found himself drawn into something beyond logic, a connection that blurred the lines between man and nature, science and fate. Was this simply an abandoned creature in need of help? Or was it the beginning of something far greater? Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an incredible story like this one. The first snow of winter had begun to fall over Pine Ridge, blanketing the small town in icy stillness. Dr. Thomas Walker pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped out of town hospital after a grueling 14-hour shift in the trauma unit. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the freshly dusted pavement, his breath curling in the frigid air as he made his way to his car. Then, movement. Near the hospital entrance, huddled against the cold stone wall, sat a small creature with tufted ears and distinctive facial markings, unmistakably a bobcat kitten. Its amber eyes, luminous in the dim light, were locked on the hospital doors with an almost human intensity. Thomas hesitated. Wild animals weren't uncommon in Pine Ridge, but they rarely ventured this close to town, let alone to a hospital. Something about the kitten's unwavering gaze stirred his curiosity. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, keeping a respectful distance. The bobcat blinked slowly but didn't retreat. Instead, it studied him, as if measuring his intentions before returning its attention to the hospital doors. Thomas noted the thinness of its frame, the way it shivered against the cold. Against his better judgment, he pulled a protein bar from his pocket, broke off a piece, and set it a few feet away before stepping back. To his surprise, the kitten cautiously approached, sniffed the offering, and delicately ate it. "You're hungry, huh?" Thomas murmured. "Where's your mother?" The kitten finished eating, then astonishingly returned to its place by the wall, eyes once again fixed on the hospital doors. Thomas checked his watch. Midnight. The temperature was plummeting. He knew he should call animal control, but something about the kitten's behavior gave him pause. It didn't seem lost or distressed. It seemed to be waiting. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he promised, glancing back one last time before heading to his car. The next evening, Thomas left the hospital through the same exit, half expecting the kitten to be gone. But there it was, sitting in the exact same spot, watching, waiting. This time, Thomas had come prepared. He set down a small container of water and some cat food he'd purchased on his lunch break, placing them a safe distance away. Once again, the kitten approached cautiously, drank thirstily, ate, and then resumed its silent vigil. For 5 consecutive nights, the pattern repeated. The kitten appeared as darkness fell, remained through the night, and was gone by morning. Its presence became a quiet mystery that lingered in Thomas's thoughts during the long, empty moments of his shifts. On the 6th night, as a brutal snowstorm descended upon Pine Ridge, Thomas arrived at the hospital with a small insulated shelter, an improvised refuge made from a storage container lined with thermal blankets. The bobcat was already there, its tiny body dusted with snow, looking more fragile than ever against the worsening storm. "You can't stay out in this," Thomas said, setting the shelter down nearby. "I don't know why you're here, but I can't let you freeze." He stepped back, watching with cautious hope. To his relief, after a few moments of hesitation, the kitten crept forward, sniffed at the shelter, and, at last, slipped inside. And so, the mystery deepened. What had drawn this wild creature to the hospital? What was it waiting for? And why, out of everyone who walked these halls, did it choose Thomas? Little did he know. The answer was coming, and it would change everything. Curled up inside the shelter, the Bobcat kitten remained watchful, its eyes still locked on the hospital doors. As Thomas turned to leave, he nearly collided with Sarah Jensen, a night shift nurse he'd worked with for years. "Sorry," he said, steadying himself. "I was distracted." Sarah followed his gaze. "Is that a bobcat?" she asked. Incredulously, Thomas nodded. "A kitten. It's been here every night for almost a week." "That's unusual," Sarah murmured, her brow furrowing. "Wild animals don't do that without a reason." "My thoughts exactly," Thomas agreed. "There's something almost purposeful about the way it watches the hospital. I can't explain it, but I feel like it's waiting for someone." Sarah's expression softened. "You always were a softie for strays, Thomas," she teased gently. "Remember that three-legged coyote you rehabilitated last year?" Thomas smiled faintly. "This feels different. There's a story here, Sarah, I can sense it." She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Well, whatever it is, be careful. Even a bobcat kitten can be dangerous if it feels threatened." "I know," Thomas assured her. "I'm keeping my distance, but I can't just ignore it, They parted. Thomas glanced back at the small shelter. Two amber eyes glinted in the darkness, still fixed on the building where countless human stories unfolded each day. Over the next 2 weeks, the bobcat's presence became a quiet fascination for Thomas. He'd started calling it Max, though he couldn't quite explain why. The name simply felt right. Every evening Max was there, waiting. Sometimes he'd venture a few feet from the shelter, but he always returned to his post, eyes fixed on the hospital entrance. Thomas found himself arriving early for his shifts just to observe him. Then, one evening, as he approached with Max's usual meal, he noticed an elderly woman kneeling near the shelter, speaking softly to the kitten. "Excuse me, ma'am," Thomas called gently, not wanting to startle either Max or the woman. "I should warn you, that's a wild animal." The woman turned, revealing a face lined with both sorrow and kindness. Her voice was raspy but warm. "I know what he is," she said. "He's Edward's little shadow." A current of recognition ran through Thomas. "Edward?" he repeated. She nodded, rising slowly to her feet. "Edward Blackwood, my neighbor. He passed away here at Town Hospital about a month ago." The pieces started falling into place. "And the bobcat?" Thomas asked. The woman, Martha Halloway, as she introduced herself, gave a small, knowing smile. "Max," she confirmed. "Edward found him last spring, barely alive after a storm wiped out a den near Timber Creek. He always had a way with wild things." "He raised a bobcat?" Thomas asked, setting down the food container. Martha nodded. "Edward lived alone. Since his wife passed 10 years ago, he was a wildlife biologist before he retired. That little bobcat gave him purpose in his final months, though none of us knew then how little time he had left." "What happened?" Thomas asked, though a sinking feeling in his gut told him he already knew. "Cancer," Martha said simply. "Pancreatic. By the time they found it, it was everywhere. He didn't want treatment, just pain management. He spent his last days at home until the pain got too bad." Her voice wavered, eyes glistening. "They brought him here at the end. He was worried about Max, made me promise to check on him. But when I went to Edward's cabin after the funeral, Max was already gone." Thomas looked at the bobcat kitten, now cautiously approaching the food container. "And now he's here," he murmured. "Waiting." Martha's gaze softened. "Animals know things we don't," she said. "Edward always said that." She exhaled a shaky breath. "I think Max is waiting for the only human he ever bonded with." A lump formed in Thomas's throat. "Has he been here every night since Edward passed?" he asked. Martha shrugged. "I couldn't say. I only spotted him by chance today when I came to visit my sister in the rehab wing, but it wouldn't surprise me. Edward and that kitten were inseparable." She hesitated, then added, "He even had a little harness for him, took him on walks in the woods." "That's unusual," Thomas said carefully. "Edward was unusual," Martha replied with a sad smile. "But he knew what he was doing. He never tried to make Max a pet. He always said he was preparing him to return to the wild when he was old enough." Her expression darkened slightly. "He just didn't expect to leave before that job was done." Max finished eating and curled back inside his shelter. His amber eyes, so full of quiet intelligence, remained locked on the hospital doors. "Was Edward a patient of mine?" Thomas asked, searching his memory. The trauma unit saw so many faces, names often blurred together in the chaos. Martha shook her head. "No, he was under Dr. Patel in oncology. Quiet man, didn't want to bother anyone, but he loved that kitten." "Something fierce," Thomas nodded, feeling a deep ache, not just for the man he'd never met, but for the wild creature still faithfully waiting for a reunion that could never come. "I should get going," Martha said, glancing at her watch. "Visiting hours are almost over, but I'm glad Max has someone looking out for him." As she walked away, Thomas crouched at a safe distance from the shelter. "So that's it, huh, Max?" he murmured. "You're waiting for Edward." The Bobcat blinked slowly, and for a fleeting moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw a flicker of understanding in those intelligent eyes. That night, during his break, Thomas found himself scrolling through hospital records. He usually respected patient privacy scrupulously, but something about Max's vigil compelled him to learn more. Edward Blackwood, 72, admitted 3 weeks earlier with severe pain, end-stage pancreatic cancer, under Dr. Patel's care. The notes described him as lucid and calm until the very end. He'd refused heroic measures, requesting only pain relief. He had passed peacefully at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Thomas exhaled, rubbing his temple. He was about to close the file when something made him pause, a notation from one of the night nurses, a patient request on his final night. Edward had asked, repeatedly, to be moved to a room with a window facing the hospital entrance. Thomas stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. Even in his final hours, Edward had wanted to be near the spot where Max now waited, waiting for him. The request had been granted, though the reason was never recorded. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a wave of emotion washing over him. Had Edward somehow known Max would come looking for him? Had he wanted to be somewhere the Bobcat kitten might see him, might sense his presence? "You okay, Doc?" Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts as she set a cup of coffee on his desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas gestured to the screen. "Remember that Bobcat kitten? I think I figured out why it's here." Sarah listened as he recounted what he'd learned from Martha and the patient records. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. "That's quite a story," she said finally. "I know it sounds crazy," Thomas admitted. "But you haven't seen the way this kitten watches the hospital. It's not random. He's looking for Edward." Sarah's voice was gentle. "Even if that's true, what can we do? The man is gone, Thomas." He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I can't just ignore it. This Bobcat kitten is literally keeping a vigil for someone he loved." "Doesn't that mean something?" Sarah studied him. "You're really invested in this, aren't you?" "I don't know why," he admitted. "Maybe because after 15 years in trauma, I've seen so much loss, so much that can't be fixed. But this, helping Max, somehow feels like something I could actually do right." Her expression softened. "What does Max need, do you think?" Thomas considered. Closure, a transition. Edward was preparing him for the wild, according to his neighbor. Maybe Max needs help completing that journey. "Then that's what you should do," Sarah said simply. "Help Max finish what Edward started." As Thomas returned to his rounds, an idea took root. A way to honor a man he'd never met, and the bond he'd formed with a wild creature. The next morning, instead of heading home after his shift, Thomas followed the address from Edward's patient file. The cabin sat at the end of a winding driveway, tucked among tall pines with a view of the mountains beyond. It looked peaceful, though a little neglected. A small sign at the edge of the property caught his eye. For sale by estate. Edward had no immediate family, it seemed. Thomas sat in his car, hands gripping the wheel. He'd come this far on instinct, but now hesitated. Would it be trespassing? To step onto a deceased man's land? Movement at the tree line caught his attention. A deer and her fawn grazing near a small, overgrown garden. Taking it as a sign, he got out. The door was locked, but under a decorative stone by the porch steps he found a key. A common hiding spot in rural areas. He hesitated, then unlocked the door. "Hello?" he called softly, though he knew no one would answer. Inside the cabin was simple but inviting. The living room was lined with bookshelves, wildlife, nature, survival guides. Photographs adorned the walls, many of Edward in remote landscapes, often with animals nearby. On the kitchen counter, a stack of unopened mail sat beside a worn notebook. Feeling like an intruder but unable to ignore his growing investment in Max's story, Thomas flipped through it. It was a journal. At first, the entries were clinical. Scientific observations on Max's weight, diet, and behavior. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Max explored the entire clearing today. His confidence grows. Daily, found him attempting to pounce on a squirrel, hunting instincts emerging right on schedule. He still returns when called, though I've been using the whistle more than my voice. Preparing him for when I'm gone. Thomas swallowed hard and flipped ahead. Pain worse today. Had to sit while watching Max practice climbing. He's nearly ready for independence, but I worry I won't be here to see it through. Martha says she'll check on him, but it's not the same. He needs gradual preparation for full wild living. I wrote to the local wildlife rehabilitation center. No response yet. Time is running short. For both of us. Thomas felt a tightness in his throat. The last entry was written in shaky handwriting. Can barely write today. Martha taking me to the hospital. Tomorrow. Max knows something is wrong, stayed by my bed all night. Hardest part of dying is leaving him before his journey is complete. He deserves his wildlife. Hope someone will help him find his way. Thomas set the journal down, exhaling. For a long moment he stood there, absorbing the weight of what he'd just read. When he finally moved, it was with new resolve. Off the kitchen he found a small room, Max's. Space. A bedding area, climbing structures, tools for training. A bridge between captivity and the wild. On a desk in the corner he discovered a folder labeled Max's Release Plan. Inside was a detailed strategy, a step-by-step process to ensure Max could survive on his own. A map marked an ideal release site. Protected land, 20 miles from the cabin. There were also brochures and letters, correspondence with a wildlife rehabilitation center. Edward had been seeking help, but in the end, he ran out of time. Thomas clenched his jaw. Maybe Edward had left too soon, but Max's journey wasn't over yet, and Thomas was going to see it through. Among the documents, Thomas found a letter Edward had never mailed, a request for assistance from the Colorado Wildlife Rehabilitation Association regarding Max's eventual release. Thomas sat heavily in the desk chair, overwhelmed by the evidence of Edward's careful planning and deep concern for the Bobcat's future. His intentions had been clear, but his illness had interrupted everything. No wonder Max had sought out the hospital. It was the last place he had sensed Edward's presence, and now he was waiting, not understanding that his human friend would never return. With renewed determination, Thomas gathered the folder and Edward's journal. He knew what he had to do. Complete Edward's plan for Max. Give the Bobcat the wildlife his friend had intended for him, and in doing so, perhaps provide closure for both Max and himself. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas immersed himself in Edward's release plan, reaching out to the wildlife rehabilitation specialists Edward had contacted, and consulting with veterinarians who specialized in wild felines. Everyone he spoke with was surprised by the unusual situation, but they all admired Edward's careful approach. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife veterinarian with extensive experience rehabilitating bobcats, agreed to assess Max's readiness for the wild. "Normally, we discourage any human-wildlife bonding," she said during their first meeting, which took place in the hospital parking lot, where Max continued his nightly vigil. "But if what you're telling me is true, if this bobcat was orphaned, naturally and prepared for release by someone who understood the species, we may be able to complete that process." Under Elena's guidance, Thomas began implementing the final phases of Edward's plan. Each night, instead of simply feeding Max at the hospital, he brought a specially designed feeding container that required the bobcat to work for his food, mimicking the problem-solving skills he would need in the wild. Additionally, Thomas started using the training whistle he had found at Edward's cabin, associating it with food rewards and gradually increasing the distance Max had to travel. To reach him, the bobcat was intelligent and adaptable, catching on quickly. "He's actually in remarkable condition," Elena observed after conducting a remote assessment using a telephoto lens. "Not too habituated to humans, beyond you. Good muscle tone, shows appropriate wariness. Edward clearly knew what he was doing. So you think he can make it in the wild?" Thomas asked hopefully. "With proper transitional support?" "Yes," Elena confirmed. "We'll need to follow a soft release protocol. Move him to a temporary enclosure at the release site. Let him acclimate, then gradually reduce his food until he's fully independent." The plan made sense. It aligned perfectly with Edward's own documented intentions. But as they finalized the details, Thomas found himself struggling with an unexpected emotion: grief. Not just for Edward, whom he had never met, but for Max, who had become a constant in his daily routine. "It's normal to form attachments," Elena assured him when he confessed his feelings. "But remember, the greatest kindness you can give Max is to help him become what nature intended. A wild bobcat, living on his own terms." Thomas knew she was right, and yet each night as he watched Max emerge from his hiding place, those amber eyes still occasionally flicking toward the hospital doors before focusing on Thomas and his whistle, he felt the weight of responsibility and connection. The morning of Max's relocation was crisp and clear, the early December air sharp with the promise of winter. Thomas had taken the day off. Elena had arranged for a specialized transport carrier and a temporary enclosure at the release site, the same location Edward had chosen. As they prepared to capture Max, who now approached without hesitation when Thomas used the whistle, Thomas suddenly hesitated. "Having second thoughts?" Elena asked gently. He shook his head. "No, it's the right thing to do, it's just—" He exhaled. "I'd like to make one stop first, if that's okay." Elena checked her watch. "As long as we get him to the site before noon, we should be fine. Where did you want to go?" Thomas hesitated, then said quietly, "The cemetery. I think Max should have a chance to say goodbye." Elena gave him a long, searching look, then nodded. "Unusual request, but under the circumstances, I'll allow it, if it doesn't stress the animal." An hour later, with Max securely but comfortably confined in the transport carrier, they stood before Edward Blackwood's simple grave in Pine Ridge Cemetery. Martha had told Thomas that Edward had been laid to rest just 3 weeks earlier. Only a handful of people had attended the funeral. Now, with Elena keeping a respectful distance, Thomas knelt and set the carrier down near the headstone. He carefully opened a small viewing panel, allowing Max to see out without any risk of escape. "Here he is, Edward," Thomas said softly, feeling slightly foolish, but compelled to complete this ritual. "I found your notes, your plans for him. We're taking him to the release site you chose. He's going to have the wildlife you wanted for him." Max's amber eyes flicked across the surroundings, his sensitive nose working to process the unfamiliar scents. For a moment he seemed agitated, shifting within the carrier. Then, to Thomas's amazement, the bobcat settled, his gaze fixed on Edward's headstone, as if in recognition. They remained like that for several quiet minutes, the winter sun catching, the frost on the grave markers turning them to crystal. Thomas found himself blinking hard against the cold. It was time. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, closing the panel. "Let's go." And with that, they left, to finish what Edward had started. As Thomas stood in the quiet cemetery, he found himself thinking about the connections that bind living beings together. Some expected, some utterly surprising, all profound in their own way. "He was my patient, you know," came a voice from behind. Thomas turned to see Dr. Emil Patel, the oncologist mentioned in Edward's hospital records, standing a few feet away with a small bouquet of winter greens. "Dr. Patel," Thomas said in surprise. "I didn't know you were coming here today. I try to visit my patients who had no family," Dr. Patel explained, approaching slowly. Then his gaze fell on the carrier. "Is that Max?" Thomas nodded. "Edward's Bobcat." Dr. Patel's eyes widened. "So it's true. Edward spoke of him often during his treatment. I thought perhaps it was the medication, or a comforting fantasy." He knelt down, peering at Max with evident wonder. "He said this little one gave him purpose in his final months." "He did more than that," Thomas said, recounting the story of Max's nightly vigil outside the hospital. As he spoke, he saw Dr. Patel's professional composure begin to crack, emotions flickering across his face. "In 15 years of oncology, I've seen many expressions of love and grief," Dr. Patel said, his voice thick. "But this," he gestured toward Max, then quickly wiped at his eyes. "What happens to him now?" Thomas explained their plan to complete Edward's work, to release Max into the wild at the exact site Edward had chosen. "He'll have every chance to thrive," Thomas assured. Dr. Patel nodded approvingly, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving of a bobcat. "Edward gave me this," he said, turning it over in his hand. "Made it himself during his treatment, said it helped keep his hands busy when the pain was bad." He placed the carving gently on the grave. "I think he'd be grateful to know Max will have his freedom." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Patel placed his bouquet against the headstone and stepped back. "Edward was special," he said. "He faced death with more grace than most. Said he'd made his peace because he'd lived true to himself and helped the wild things survive." His voice broke slightly. "I think he would be proud to see this." Moment, Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. As they said their goodbyes to Dr. Patel and to Edward, Thomas carried Max back to the vehicle, where Elena waited patiently. "I see now why this mattered so much to you," she said quietly as they drove toward the mountains. "This is about more than just wildlife conservation," Thomas agreed. "It's about keeping a promise, one man to another, across the boundary of death, and about respecting the connections we form, no matter how unlikely," Elena added. The release site was everything Edward had described. A protected valley with fresh water, ample prey, and natural shelter. Remote enough to be safe, yet accessible enough for monitoring. Elena and her colleague had already constructed a spacious temporary enclosure among the trees, designed to allow Max time to acclimate while keeping him safe. As they transferred him to his new home, Thomas was struck by how alert and engaged Max seemed, his nose working constantly, taking in the sense of his natural habitat. There was no sign of the patient little vigiler from the hospital parking lot, just a wild creature, responding to the call of his true environment. "He already looks different," Thomas observed, watching Max cautiously explore the enclosure. "They always do when they're back where they belong," Elena agreed. "We'll check on him daily, gradually reducing human contact over the next 2 weeks. Then we'll open the enclosure but continue supplemental feeding at decreasing intervals for another month. By early spring, he should be fully independent." Thomas nodded, feeling both satisfaction and a sharp pang of loss. "Will you let me know when he's ready for the final release?" Elena smiled. "Of course, you've earned that right." In the following weeks, Thomas received regular updates and photos from Elena's team. Max was adapting exceptionally well, showing strong hunting instincts, appropriate wariness around humans. His coat had thickened against the winter cold, and he had already successfully caught several small prey within the enclosure. Then, in late January, Elena called with the news Thomas had been waiting for. We're ready for the final release. The enclosure door will be left open tomorrow morning, Elena told Thomas over the phone. If you'd like to be present, you should arrive by sunrise. Thomas arranged for another day off and made the drive. In the pre-dawn darkness, his headlights catching the occasional snowflake as a light storm began. At the trailhead, Elena was waiting. They hiked in together, speaking little in the hush of the winter morning. At the enclosure, 2 other wildlife specialists were making final preparations, removing anything that might obstruct Max's path to freedom. The young Bobcat watched from a high perch, alert but calm, his amber eyes occasionally meeting Thomas's, as if in recognition. We don't make a ceremony of it, Elena explained softly. We simply open the door and step back. He'll leave when he's ready. They retreated to an observation blind 50 yards away, as one of the specialists carefully slid open the enclosure door before joining them. Then they waited. As the sky lightened to a pearly gray, Max remained on his perch, occasionally stretching or grooming, showing no immediate interest in the open door. Thomas began to wonder if the Bobcat would choose to leave at all. Then, as the first rays of direct sunlight broke through the clouds and dappled the forest floor, Max stirred. With silent grace, he descended from his perch, moving toward the open door with cautious curiosity. Pausing at the threshold, he flared his nostrils, tasting the cold morning air. Thomas held his breath. Max took one step outside, then another. For a moment, he hesitated, his intelligent amber eyes scanning his surroundings. Then, as if acknowledging their presence, he turned his head toward the blind, and then, with a fluid motion that spoke of his wild heritage, Max bounded into the forest. His tawny coat vanished among the trees. Thomas felt tears spill onto his face. Edward's final legacy had claimed his birthright. He'll be fine, Elena assured him, her own voice not entirely steady. We'll monitor from a distance, but everything indicates he has what he needs to succeed. As they hiked back to their vehicles, the sun now fully risen over a world dusted. With fresh snow, Thomas found himself thinking of Edward's journal entry. He deserves his wild life. Hope someone will help him find his way. Thank you, Thomas said as they reached the trailhead. Not just for your expertise, but for understanding why this mattered. Elena smiled. Wildlife rehabilitation isn't just about the animals, no. It's about maintaining the right relationship between humans and the natural world, respecting boundaries while acknowledging connections. Thomas nodded, thinking of Edward, of Max, and of his own unexpected role in their story. I learned something important through all this, he admitted. In the trauma unit, we're so focused on saving lives that sometimes we forget about the quality of those lives, or the meaning people find in their final chapters. Edward found meaning in helping Max, Elena said, and you found meaning in finishing his work. It's a chain of care, Thomas agreed. Different from what I'm used to, but healing in its own way. As he drove back toward Pine Ridge, he felt lighter than he had in months, perhaps years. The constant weight of emergency decision-making, of lives hanging in the balance, seemed momentarily lifted. In its place was a quiet certainty. He had helped bridge a gap between human compassion and wild freedom, between one life ending and another beginning. 3 days later, Elena sent him a single photo, captured by a remote wildlife camera. It showed Max, confident and alert, moving through his new territory with the deliberate purpose of a bobcat, who knew exactly where he belonged. Thomas printed the photo and placed it in a small frame on his desk at the hospital. Whenever the pressures of trauma medicine threatened to overwhelm him, he would look at that image and remember not just what it meant to save a life, but what it meant to honor one, both human and wild. In the spring, as wildflowers bloomed on Edward's grave, Thomas and Dr. Patel arranged for a small plaque to be placed there. Friend to wild things. A simple tribute to a man Thomas had never met, but whose legacy had changed him profoundly. And somewhere, beyond Pine Ridge, in the protected wilderness Edward had chosen, A young bobcat moved through the dappled sunlight, free and thriving, carrying forward a chain of care that had begun with one man's compassion and continued through another's promise kept.